The notification sound from her banking app cut through the quiet of Rachel Martinez's downtown Portland loft, like a knife through silk. She glanced at her phone, expecting to see her monthly salary deposit confirmation, but instead found something that made her blood run cold. A withdrawal of $1,200 from her checking account, initiated by someone with shared access, someone who had promised this would only be used for emergencies. The memo line read simply, "Family contribution, monthly dues." Rachel stared at the screen, her coffee growing cold in her hands, as the weight of 28 years of financial manipulation crashed down on her like a house of cards built on lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel Martinez had always been good with numbers. At 28, she worked as a senior financial analyst for a renewable energy startup in downtown Portland, earning $82,000 a year after 6 years of climbing the corporate ladder, one spreadsheet at a time. Her corner apartment in the Pearl District wasn't huge, but it was hers, filled with plants she'd nursed from seeds and furniture she'd saved months to afford. Every morning, she'd wake to the sound of the streetcar rumbling past her window and the smell of fresh coffee from the roastery downstairs. It was a life she'd built, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, with no help from anyone. The Martinez family gathered every third Saturday of the month at their parents' sprawling suburban home in Beaverton, a beige colonial that had housed 3 generations of complicated family dynamics. Rachel's mother, Carmen, had been orchestrating these mandatory gatherings for as long as anyone could remember, treating them like board meetings where attendance wasn't optional and dissent wasn't welcome. The house always smelled like her grandmother's mole recipe and sounded like a negotiation between diplomats who'd forgotten they were supposed to be on the same side. Rachel pulled into the driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, not because she was punctual by nature, but because arriving early meant getting cornered by her mother for pre-meeting strategy sessions, and arriving late meant walking into a room where decisions about her life had already been made without her input. She sat in her Honda Civic for 30 seconds, watching her sister Isabella's white BMW convertible gleaming in the afternoon sun, a car that cost more than Rachel made in 6 months, but somehow never seemed to strain Isabella's finances the way basic groceries strained everyone else's. The front door opened before Rachel could knock, revealing her father, Miguel, a man who'd spent 40 years managing a construction company by avoiding conflict and delegating difficult conversations to his wife. He pulled Rachel into a brief hug that felt more like a corporate handshake disguised as affection. Inside, the living room was arranged like a courtroom. Carmen sat in her usual spot on the burgundy leather sofa, a stack of papers spread across the coffee table like evidence in a trial nobody wanted to attend. Isabella lounged in the armchair by the window, her honey blonde hair catching the light in a way that made her look like she was posing for a magazine shoot, even when she was just checking her phone. At 25, Isabella had mastered the art of looking effortlessly put together, while everyone around her scrambled to keep up with the chaos she left in her wake. Rachel's younger brother Diego, 22 and still living at home while he figured out what he wanted to do with his life, sat cross-legged on the floor, playing a game on his tablet, earbuds in, blissfully unaware that his presence at these meetings was more decorative than functional. He'd learned early that, as long as he showed up and looked busy, the family's attention would focus on the sisters, leaving him free to exist in peaceful irrelevance. Carmen looked up as Rachel settled onto the sofa, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd been planning this conversation for weeks. The papers on the coffee table weren't random documents, Rachel realized, but financial statements, bank records, and what looked like a handwritten budget breakdown with everyone's names listed in careful columns. "Now that we're all here," Carmen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been making unilateral family decisions for 3 decades. "We need to talk about something important, something that affects all of us." Rachel glanced at Isabella, who was still scrolling through her phone but wearing the subtle smile of someone who already knew the punchline to a joke nobody else had heard yet. Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his recliner, the way he always did when his wife was about to announce something that would require him to either support an unpopular decision or face weeks of cold shoulders and passive-aggressive comments about his lack of family loyalty. Isabella has been struggling financially, Carmen continued, organizing the papers in front of her like a prosecutor laying out evidence. The gallery where she works cut her hours, her car payment is behind, and she's been living on credit cards for months. We can't let our daughter drown when we have the means to help her. Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach. The word we, in her mother's vocabulary, had a way of meaning you when it came to actual sacrifice, while somehow meaning us when it came to taking credit for generosity. She'd learned this distinction the hard way over the years, watching her mother volunteer Rachel's time, money, and energy for family causes, while positioning herself as the architect of their collective compassion. I've been thinking about this for weeks, Carmen continued, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered in her precise handwriting. And I think the fairest solution is to create a family fund. Everyone contributes according to their ability, and we use it to help family members when they're in crisis. Isabella finally looked up from her phone, her green eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm people usually reserve for vacation announcements or lottery winnings. It's like a safety net, she said, her voice sweet and reasonable, so nobody has to worry about falling through the cracks. Rachel studied the legal pad her mother was now turning toward her, seeing her own name listed at the top of a contribution chart. Next to it was a number that made her throat close up, $800 per month. Below that, her parents were listed for $200 each, Diego for $50, and Isabella's name appeared at the bottom with a zero next to it, accompanied by a note that read, "Temporary recipient status." $800? Rachel managed to say, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. That's almost half my take-home pay. Carmen nodded as if Rachel had just confirmed something obvious. Exactly. You're the most financially stable, you don't have children or major expenses, and you make more than anyone else in the family. It only makes sense that you'd contribute the most to keeping this family afloat. Rachel looked around the room, searching for any sign that someone else found this proposal as insane as she did. Miguel was studying his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. Diego had apparently turned his music up loud enough that he could pretend not to hear the conversation happening 3 feet away from him. Isabella was nodding along as if her mother had just suggested they all wear matching sweaters to church on Sunday. What happens when Isabella gets back on her feet? Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice level. Does the fun disappear? Or do we just find someone else to rescue? Carmen's expression shifted into the patient smile she used when explaining simple concepts to slow children. That's the beauty of this system, Mija. It's not about rescuing anyone. It's about creating security for everyone. Next month, it might be you who needs help, or Diego when he starts college, or your father if the construction market slows down. This way, we're all protected. Rachel felt like she was watching a magic trick, where the magician was explaining exactly how the illusion worked while somehow making it more confusing instead of clearer. The fund wasn't about creating security for everyone. It was about creating a mechanism for transferring money from Rachel's bank account to Isabella's credit card bills while making it sound like a mutual benefit society. I need to think about this, Rachel said, buying herself time to figure out how to say no without triggering the emotional warfare that always followed family meetings, where she didn't immediately agree to everything. Isabella leaned forward, her expression shifting to something that might have been concern if it weren't so obviously practiced. Rach, I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice. You know I hate taking money from family, but I'm drowning here. My credit cards are maxed out, I'm 3 months behind on my car payment, and if I don't come up with rent money by next week, I'll have to move back home. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Isabella moving back home would mean months of drama, chaos, and her parents' complete attention focused on managing her crisis, while everyone else's needs got pushed to the background. It would mean Rachel's childhood bedroom getting converted into Isabella's temporary art studio, family dinners becoming strategy sessions about Isabella's love life, and every conversation somehow circling back to how everyone could better support Isabella's journey of self-discovery. Carmen picked up a sheet of paper from the coffee table and handed it to Rachel. I've already set up the joint account. All you need to do is add your bank information for the automatic transfer. The first contribution would be next Friday, so Isabella can catch up on her bills before they shut off her utilities. Rachel stared at the bank form, seeing her name already filled in at the top in her mother's handwriting. Below that were signature lines for all the account holders, with Carmen and Miguel's signatures already in place. It was a checking account at the credit union, where the family had banked for 20 years, which meant the staff knew them all by name and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about why one person was depositing money while another person was withdrawing it. "You've already opened the account?" Rachel asked, feeling like she'd been enrolled in a subscription service she'd never agreed to sign up for. "I wanted to make it as easy as possible for everyone," Carmen replied. "All the paperwork is done. The routing numbers are ready, and I've even set up online access so we can all monitor the balance and see where the money is going. Complete transparency." Rachel realized this wasn't a family meeting. It was a contract signing ceremony disguised as a discussion. Her mother had already made the decision, completed the paperwork, and now she was just waiting for Rachel to provide her signature and banking information to make the money transfer official. The appearance of consultation was just a courtesy, like asking someone if they wanted mustard on a sandwich you'd already made. "What if I can't afford $800 a month?" Rachel asked, testing whether there was any flexibility in this carefully orchestrated plan. Carmen's smile faltered slightly, revealing the steel underneath the maternal warmth. "Mija, you live alone in an expensive apartment, you eat out all the time, and you just bought a new laptop last month. I think if you really looked at your budget, you'd find $800 without breaking a sweat." Rachel felt her cheeks flush. Her mother's accounting of her spending habits was simultaneously accurate and completely missing the point. Yes, she lived alone in an apartment that cost $1,800 a month, but she'd chosen it specifically because it was close to work and eliminated her need for a car payment. Yes, she ate out frequently, but that was because working 50-hour weeks left little time for grocery shopping and meal prep, and yes, she'd bought a new laptop, but only after her previous one died, and she needed it for work. Every expense her mother had mentioned was the result of careful consideration and budgeting, not frivolous spending. But explaining this would require defending choices she had every right to make with money she'd earned, and Rachel had learned long ago that defending herself to her mother was like trying to win an argument with someone who kept changing the rules mid-conversation. Isabella reached over and touched Rachel's arm, her expression soft and sisterly. "I know it's a lot to ask, and I promise I'll pay it back as soon as I get on my feet. This is just temporary, until I can find a better job or maybe sell some of my paintings. I've been working on a new series that my boss thinks could really take off." Rachel had been hearing about Isabella's breakthrough art series for 3 years. It was always just around the corner, always about to revolutionize her career, always 6 months away from making her financially independent. In the meantime, Isabella's lifestyle hadn't adjusted to match her income, which seemed to hover somewhere between part-time gallery assistant wages and fantasy novelist earnings. "How long is temporary?" Rachel asked, realizing she was already negotiating the terms of her surrender instead of figuring out how to escape the trap entirely. Carmen consulted her legal pad as if the answer required extensive research. "Let's say 6 months to start, and then we'll reassess based on how everyone's doing. If Isabella's situation improves faster than expected, we can reduce the contributions. If someone else needs help, we can adjust the amounts accordingly." 6 months of $800 was $4,800, Rachel calculated automatically. That was more than she'd spent on rent in 3 months, more than her car was worth, more than she'd managed to save in her emergency fund after 2 years of careful budgeting. It was also exactly the amount Isabella owed on her credit cards, according to the financial statements Carmen had been shuffling through during the conversation. Rachel looked around the room one more time, hoping to catch someone's eye and see a flicker of recognition that this was insane. But Miguel was now completely absorbed in a sports magazine he'd picked up from the side table. Diego had escalated to full noise-canceling headphones, and Isabella was back to scrolling through her phone, apparently confident that the business portion of the meeting was concluded, and all that remained was Rachel's signature on the dotted line. "I need some time to adjust my budget," Rachel said finally, knowing it was a weak compromise but hoping to buy herself a few days to figure out how to extract herself from this financial quicksand. Carmen smiled the satisfied smile of someone who'd just closed a difficult sale. "Of course, Misha. But remember, Isabella's rent is due next Friday, so we'll need your banking information by Wednesday to process the first transfer on time. Rachel nodded, folded the bank form, and slipped it into her purse, feeling like she was carrying a warrant for her own financial execution. The rest of the family meeting blurred past in a haze of small talk and dessert, with everyone acting as if they hadn't just redistributed Rachel's income without her meaningful consent. As she drove home through the familiar streets of Portland, Rachel tried to understand how $800 of her money had become a family asset without anyone asking if she could afford to lose it. The math was simple enough. She made about $5,200 a month after taxes, spent $1,800 on rent, $400 on utilities and insurance, $600 on food and transportation, and tried to save whatever was left after covering the random expenses that always seemed to pop up. Losing $800 a month would mean eliminating her savings entirely and cutting into the buffer that kept her from living paycheck to paycheck. But the emotional math was more complicated. Saying no would mean being labeled selfish, unsupportive, and cruel to her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Struggling sister. It would mean facing her mother's disappointment and her father's awkward attempts to mediate. It would mean listening to Isabella's tearful phone calls about how she'd thought family was supposed to help family, and how Rachel's refusal proved she cared more about money than love. Rachel parked in her building's garage and sat in the silence for several minutes, watching the concrete walls and thinking about the bank form in her purse. Part of her wanted to tear it up and throw it away, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But another part of her, the part that had been trained since childhood to prioritize family harmony over personal boundaries, was already calculating whether she could afford to be a good daughter and sister, even if it meant sacrificing her own financial security. She took the elevator to her apartment, unlocked the door, and stood in her living room looking at the space she'd created for herself. The plants on the windowsill were thriving under the grow lights she'd installed. The bookshelf was organized by color, a small act of control in a life where so many decisions seemed to be made by other people. The couch was exactly the shade of blue she'd wanted, purchased after months of saving and comparison shopping. This apartment represented 6 years of choices, sacrifices, and careful planning. Every piece of furniture had been researched, every expense had been budgeted, every decoration had been chosen to reflect her taste and values. It was the first place she'd ever lived that felt completely hers, free from family input or supervision. Rachel pulled the bank form out of her purse and spread it on her dining table, reading through the terms and conditions she'd been too overwhelmed to process during the meeting. The account required all holders to approve withdrawals over $500, but Carmen had thoughtfully included a clause that allowed for automatic monthly transfers up to $1,000 per contributor without additional authorization. Isabella was listed as the primary beneficiary, with access to withdraw funds for pre-approved family expenses. The more Rachel read, the more she realized this wasn't a mutual aid society. It was a sophisticated system for transferring her income to her sister's bank account, while maintaining the illusion of family cooperation. Isabella wouldn't have to justify her withdrawals or prove her need. Carmen would monitor the account and approve Isabella's requests based on her own assessment of what constituted a family emergency. Rachel would have the privilege of watching her money disappear into Isabella's financial black hole, while being thanked for her generosity. She set the form aside and opened her laptop, logging into her own banking app to review her finances with fresh eyes. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe $800 a month was feasible if she really scrutinized her spending and eliminated everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Maybe she could afford to be the family's financial safety net if she just tried harder to live within her means. But as Rachel scrolled through 3 months of transaction history, she realized her spending wasn't frivolous or careless. Every purchase had a purpose. Every expense served a need. The dinners out were often working meals with clients or colleagues. The subscription services were tools she used for work or health. The occasional splurges were rewards for meeting goals or treats she'd saved for specifically. The idea of cutting her budget by $800 a month wasn't just about eating fewer restaurant meals or canceling streaming services. It would mean fundamentally changing how she lived, eliminating the small comforts and conveniences that made her demanding job bearable, and returning to the financial anxiety she'd worked so hard to escape. Rachel closed her laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. Portland spread out below her like a circuit board, each light representing someone else's choices, struggles, and victories. Somewhere out there, other people were probably having similar conversations with their families, negotiating the boundaries between obligation and self-preservation, trying to figure out how much they could afford to give without losing themselves in the process. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Isabella. "Thanks again for being so understanding about the family fund. I know it's a big ask, but it means everything to know you have my back. Love you, sis." Rachel stared at the message, noting how it was phrased as gratitude for something she hadn't actually agreed to yet. Isabella was already treating her consent as a foregone conclusion, already moving forward with the assumption that the money would start flowing next week. It was a small thing, but it felt like another example of how her family operated, making decisions first and seeking permission later, if at all. She didn't respond to the text. Instead, she ordered takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant, poured herself a glass of wine, and tried to imagine what her life would look like if she signed that bank form. No more spontaneous weekend trips to the coast. No more buying books without checking the library first. No more comfortable financial buffer between herself and the kind of stress that kept people awake at night calculating whether they could afford groceries and gas in the same week. But also no more family meetings where she was labeled selfish for prioritizing her own financial stability. No more guilt about Isabella's struggles or her parents' disappointment. No more being the family member who always said no, who always found excuses, who always put her own needs ahead of family loyalty. Rachel finished her dinner and went to bed without making a decision, hoping that sleep would bring clarity about whether $800 a month was the price of peace or the cost of her independence. But as she lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the city outside her window, she realized the real question wasn't about money at all. It was about whether she was willing to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford for herself in order to maintain relationships with people who seemed more interested in her bank account than her well-being. The bank form sat on her dining table like an unfinished exam, waiting for her to fill in the answers that would determine whether she remained financially independent or became a contributing member of the Isabella Support Fund. Either way, Rachel suspected her life was about to change in ways she hadn't anticipated when she woke up that morning, before the family meeting that had turned her monthly budget into a family asset. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether being a good sister was worth sacrificing her financial security, or whether setting boundaries was worth the family drama that would inevitably follow. Tonight, she just wanted to sleep in her own bed, in her own apartment, while she still knew for certain that both belonged entirely to her. Rachel woke up at 3 a.m. with her heart racing. The bank form's image burned into her mind like a neon sign she couldn't switch off. She lay in the darkness of her bedroom, listening to the distant hum of late-night traffic and the soft whir of her air purifier, trying to understand why $800 felt like such an enormous sum, when Isabella routinely spent that much on a weekend shopping trip to the outlet malls. The numbers kept circling in her head like vultures. $800 was her grocery budget for 2 months. It was the cost of the professional development course she'd been planning to take to advance her career. It was 3 months of her gym membership, 2 months of student loan payments, or the entire amount she'd budgeted for her best friend's wedding gift and the associated travel expenses. But more than the math, what bothered Rachel was the familiar feeling of being maneuvered into a corner by people who claimed to love her. She'd experienced this sensation so many times throughout her life that she recognized it like an old song playing on the radio, each note predictable even as it filled her with the same sense of helpless frustration. The first time she remembered feeling this way, she was 12 years old, and her parents had volunteered her to babysit Isabella's friend's younger siblings during a family barbecue. Rachel had been looking forward to swimming and playing volleyball with the other kids, but instead found herself changing diapers and preventing toddlers from falling into the pool while everyone else enjoyed the party. When she complained, her mother had given her that same patient smile and explained that responsible people help others, and wouldn't Rachel rather be known as responsible than selfish? Even then, Rachel had noticed that Isabella never seemed to be available for these character-building exercises in responsibility. Isabella had been busy that day practicing her dance routine for an upcoming recital. which apparently couldn't be interrupted even for family obligations. It was Rachel's first lesson in how family dynamics worked. Some people were designated as givers, others as receivers, and questioning these roles was considered a sign of poor character rather than legitimate grievance. The pattern had continued throughout high school, where Rachel worked 20 hours a week at a grocery store to pay for her own clothes, school supplies, and social activities, while Isabella received a generous allowance that somehow never seemed to cover her expenses. When Isabella needed money for homecoming dress alterations or last-minute group dinner plans, the request always came through their parents, who would suggest that Rachel could loan her sister the money, since Rachel was so good at saving and budgeting. These loans were never repaid, not because Isabella was malicious, but because she seemed to genuinely forget that the money had come from anywhere specific. In Isabella's mind, family resources were communal property, and tracking who contributed what was unnecessarily petty. She would thank Rachel effusively for her generosity, promise to pay her back as soon as possible, and then move on to the next expense emergency without any apparent memory of the previous debt. Rachel had tried keeping a written record of these transactions during her junior year, but when she presented Isabella with a list showing $400 in unpaid loans, her sister had been genuinely hurt and confused. Isabella couldn't understand why Rachel was treating family support like a business transaction, why she was keeping score instead of just being happy to help someone she loved. Their mother had sided with Isabella, explaining that Rachel's accounting was making everyone uncomfortable and that family relationships shouldn't be reduced to spreadsheets. College had provided a temporary escape from this dynamic, but even 3 states away at the University of Colorado, Rachel had found herself fielding regular requests for emergency funds. Isabella's car would break down, requiring immediate repairs that their parents couldn't cover. Isabella would discover she was short on rent money after spending her food budget on art supplies for a class project. Isabella would need money for textbooks, winter clothes, or medical bills that her student insurance didn't fully cover. Each request came with detailed explanations of the crisis, heartfelt promises of repayment, and subtle reminders of how much Isabella missed her sister and valued their relationship. Rachel would transfer the money from her own carefully managed budget, usually by picking up extra shifts at her campus job or skipping social activities that cost money. She told herself that helping family was what good people did, that her ability to manage money came with the responsibility to help those who struggled with it. The system had worked, in a sense, because Rachel had always found a way to make the numbers add up. She'd eaten more ramen noodles and fewer restaurant meals, chosen generic brands over name brands, walked more places instead of taking rideshare services. She'd become expert at stretching her budget to accommodate both her own needs and Isabella's emergencies, convincing herself that her frugality was a virtue rather than a survival strategy. But lying in her Portland apartment at 3 a.m, Rachel realized that the family fund represented a formalization of this lifelong pattern. Instead of irregular emergency requests, she would now be making regular monthly payments into Isabella's lifestyle. Instead of being asked to help in specific crises, she would be expected to fund Isabella's general existence. The arrangement would transform her from an occasionally generous sister into a permanent financial sponsor, with all the obligations and none of the decision-making power. Rachel got up and walked to her kitchen, making herself a cup of chamomile tea and sitting at her dining table with the bank form spread in front of her. By the light of her pendant lamp, she read through the document again, this time focusing on the fine print she'd been too overwhelmed to process during the family meeting. The joint account wasn't just a savings fund where family members could contribute and withdraw equally. Carmen had structured it as a managed account where she served as the primary administrator, with authority to approve or deny withdrawal requests based on her assessment of need. Isabella was listed as the primary beneficiary, with automatic approval for withdrawals up to $1,500 per month for living expenses. Rachel, despite being the largest contributor, had the same withdrawal privileges as Diego, whose $50 monthly contribution barely covered the account's maintenance fees. The arrangement wasn't designed to help Rachel if she ever needed assistance. It was designed to create a reliable income stream for Isabella, while distributing the cost among family members who were expected to contribute according to their ability to pay, rather than their willingness to participate. Rachel's $800 monthly contribution wasn't based on what she could comfortably afford, but on what the family had determined she should be able to afford based on their interpretation of her lifestyle and expenses. Rachel realized that her family had conducted an audit of her financial life without her knowledge or consent, reaching conclusions about her spending habits, priorities, and obligations that she'd never been asked to verify or approve. They'd decided that her apartment was too expensive, her dining habits too extravagant, and her savings too robust, and had designed the family fund to redirect what they considered her excess income toward what they considered a more worthy cause. The presumption felt breathtaking in its scope. Carmen had apparently reviewed Rachel's social media posts, observed her purchases during family gatherings, and made calculations about her income and expenses based on second-hand information and assumptions. She'd then presented these calculations as facts, using them to justify an $800 monthly obligation that would fundamentally restructure Rachel's financial life. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Micha, I forgot to mention that the credit union needs your banking information by noon on Wednesday to set up the automatic transfer for Friday. I can pick up the paperwork from you tomorrow evening if that's easier than you dropping it off." The message carried the tone of administrative efficiency, as if Rachel's participation had already been confirmed and all that remained was handling the logistical details. There was no acknowledgement that Rachel might still be considering whether to participate, no recognition that she might need more time to adjust her budget or explore alternatives. Carmen was moving forward with the assumption that Rachel's signature was a foregone conclusion. Rachel set her phone aside without responding and walked to her home office, a small room she'd converted from a second bedroom by installing built-in shelves and a standing desk. The space held her professional certifications, financial planning books, and the records she kept of her own carefully managed budget. She pulled out her laptop and opened the spreadsheet where she tracked every expense, income source, and savings goal. Looking at her financial life, laid out in neat columns and color-coded categories, Rachel felt a surge of pride mixed with protective anger. This budget represented years of discipline, planning, and sacrifice. Every line item had been considered and justified. Every savings goal had been chosen to support her long-term security and independence. The emergency fund had been built one small deposit at a time, the retirement contributions had been calculated to ensure she wouldn't burden her family in old age, and the professional development budget had been created to advance her career and earning potential. The family fund would eliminate most of these carefully planned elements of her financial life. $800 a month would wipe out her emergency fund contributions, her professional development budget, her vacation savings, and the extra payments she'd been making toward her student loans. It would reduce her from someone building toward financial independence to someone living paycheck to paycheck, with the difference going to subsidize her sister's inability to live within her means. Rachel opened a new browser tab and began researching Isabella's financial situation with the analytical skills she used for work. Isabella's social media accounts painted a picture of someone who didn't appear to be experiencing the financial crisis that had prompted the family emergency meeting. Her Instagram stories from the past month showed expensive coffee drinks, new clothing purchases, dinner at upscale restaurants, and a weekend trip to the wine country that must have cost several $100s. The disconnect between Isabella's claimed financial distress and her documented spending patterns made Rachel feel like she was being asked to subsidize a lifestyle rather than address an emergency. Isabella wasn't struggling to afford basic necessities. She was struggling to afford the lifestyle she wanted while maintaining the lifestyle she was accustomed to. The family fund would allow her to continue spending freely while transferring the responsibility for financial discipline to her family members. Rachel closed her laptop and returned to her bedroom, but sleep remained elusive. She lay in the darkness, thinking about the conversation she would need to have with her family, trying to imagine how to explain her concerns without being labeled selfish or unsupportive. Every argument she could think of sounded reasonable in her own mind, but felt like it would be dismissed as selfishness by people who'd already decided that her reluctance to contribute proved she cared more about money than family. The next morning, Rachel called in sick to work, something she'd done only twice in 6 years, and never for mental health reasons. She needed time to think without the distraction of client meetings and project deadlines, time to figure out how to navigate a family crisis that felt like it had been designed to trap her, regardless of what choice she made. She spent the morning walking through Laurelhurst Park, trying to clear her head and gain perspective on the situation. The familiar paths and towering trees had always helped her think through difficult problems, but today even the peaceful surroundings couldn't quiet the anxious churning in her mind. She felt like she was being asked to choose between financial security and family relationships, between self-preservation and family loyalty, between being a good sister and being a responsible adult. By noon, Rachel had made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She wasn't going to sign the bank form, but she also wasn't going to simply refuse and hope the issue would disappear. Instead, she was going to take control of the situation by gathering information, setting boundaries, and creating alternatives that addressed the real problems without sacrificing her own financial stability. Rachel's first stop was the public library, where she spent 2 hours researching family financial planning, boundary setting, and conflict resolution. She discovered that family financial entanglement was a common source of relationship problems, and that many families struggled to balance individual needs with collective responsibilities. She also learned that enabling financially irresponsible family members often made their problems worse rather than better, creating dependency relationships that harmed everyone involved. Armed with this information, Rachel drove to a coffee shop near her office and called her best friend Jennifer, who worked as a social worker and had experience helping families navigate complex relationship dynamics. Jennifer listened to Rachel's summary of the family fund proposal with increasingly pointed questions about the decision-making process, the accountability measures, and the exit strategy. So your sister gets unlimited access to the money, your mother controls all the decisions about how it's used, and you get to contribute $800 a month with no vote in how it's spent? Jennifer asked, her voice carrying the professional skepticism she used when evaluating whether her clients' family situations were healthy or harmful. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible, Rachel admitted, but my family thinks I'm being selfish for hesitating. They keep saying it's only temporary, and that family is supposed to help family. Jennifer was quiet for a moment before responding. Rachel, I work with families in crisis every day, and I can tell you that healthy families don't handle financial problems by extracting money from the most responsible member without their meaningful consent. This isn't about helping Isabella. This is about enabling her while making you responsible for the consequences of her choices. The conversation lasted an hour, with Jennifer helping Rachel understand that the family fund wasn't a financial emergency response, but a relationship restructuring that would change her role from sister to sponsor. Jennifer also pointed out that Rachel's reluctance to participate wasn't selfishness, but a healthy recognition that the proposed arrangement was unfair and unsustainable. Rachel left the coffee shop feeling more confident in her instincts, but also more aware of how difficult the upcoming family conversation would be. She spent the afternoon researching alternatives to the family fund, looking for options that would help Isabella without creating a permanent financial dependency relationship. By evening, Rachel had developed a counterproposal that felt fair to everyone involved. Instead of contributing to a monthly fund, she would offer to help Isabella create a budget, find additional income sources, and apply for financial assistance programs. She would also offer to loan Isabella a specific amount of money at low interest, with a clear repayment schedule and accountability measures. The goal would be to help Isabella become financially independent, rather than making her financially dependent on family support. Rachel typed up her counterproposal in a professional format, treating it like a business document rather than a family discussion. She included budget worksheets, resource lists, and a timeline for Isabella to achieve financial independence. The document was 3 pages long and represented several hours of research and careful consideration. Wednesday morning arrived with a text message from Carmen. The bank closes at 5 today, and they need your paperwork before then. Should I come get it from your office, or will you drop it off at the house? Rachel stared at the message, recognizing the pressure tactics disguised as helpful reminders. Her mother was creating artificial urgency and limiting Rachel's options to make refusal more difficult. By framing the conversation around logistics rather than consent, Carmen was treating Rachel's participation as a settled matter that just needed administrative completion. Instead of responding to the text, Rachel called her mother directly. Carmen answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the forced cheerfulness she used when she was determined to control a conversation's tone and direction. Mija, perfect timing. I was just about to drive over to the bank to add your information to the account. Did you want to meet me there, or should I pick up your paperwork first? Mom, I need to talk to you about the family fund, Rachel said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. I've been thinking about it, and I have some concerns about how it's structured. Carmen's voice shifted subtly, taking on the patient tone she used when she was about to explain why someone's concerns were unnecessary. What kind of concerns, Mija? Your father and I went over all the details very carefully. The account is completely transparent, and everyone knows exactly where their money is going. That's actually one of my concerns, Rachel replied. I don't have any input into how the money is used, but I'm expected to contribute more than anyone else. It doesn't feel like a family fund. It feels like a Isabella fund that the family is paying for. The silence that followed was the kind Carmen used to indicate that someone had said something inappropriate that didn't deserve a response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of disappointment and surprise. Rachel, I'm shocked that you would characterize helping your sister as paying for her. This is about family supporting family during a difficult time. Isabella would do the same for you if your situations were reversed. Rachel felt the familiar tug of guilt and self-doubt that always followed her mother's expressions of disappointment. But this time, she pushed through it instead of surrendering to it. Would she? Because when I was struggling in college, Isabella never offered to help with my expenses. When I was saving for my apartment deposit, she never contributed to my fund. This arrangement seems to go in one direction only. Carmen's breathing became audible through the phone, a sign that Rachel had moved from raising concerns to challenging family mythology. Your sister was in school then, Misha? She didn't have money to help because she was trying to build her own career. Now she's an adult facing adult problems, and we all need to step up. I am stepping up, Rachel said, feeling stronger with each word. I've written up a counter-proposal that would help Isabella become financially independent instead of financially dependent. I think that's better for everyone in the long run. The suggestion landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of silence that seemed to expand through the phone connection. When Carmen finally responded, her voice had dropped to the low register she used when she was truly angry but trying to maintain control. Rachel, we don't need a counter-proposal. We need family members who are willing to help without turning everything into a business negotiation. Isabella doesn't need a lecture about budgeting. She needs financial support while she gets back on her feet. Rachel realized that her mother's resistance wasn't about the specific terms of the family fund, but about the challenge to her authority to make unilateral decisions about how family resources should be allocated. Carmen had presented the fund as a family decision, but she was treating any modification or alternative as an act of rebellion rather than legitimate input. I'm going to email you my proposal, Rachel said. I think it offers better solutions for everyone, including Isabella. Maybe we can discuss it at dinner on Sunday. Carmen's response was immediate and sharp. Rachel, the bank needs your information today. We can't keep Isabella waiting while you write reports about why helping your sister is too complicated. Either you're part of this family's solution, or you're part of the problem. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, clear and unmistakable. Rachel was being asked to choose between immediate compliance and family rejection, between financial sacrifice and emotional exile. It was a choice designed to eliminate deliberation and force submission through fear of abandonment. But instead of feeling trapped, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in family conflicts before: clarity. The choice her mother was offering wasn't really a choice at all, and recognizing that helped Rachel understand that she needed to create her own options rather than selecting from the limited alternatives her family provided. I'm not going to the bank today, Rachel said, her voice steady and calm. And I'm not going to sign up for the family fund as it's currently structured. I love Isabella and I want to help her, but not in a way that makes her problems my responsibility while giving me no voice in the solutions. Carmen's silence was different this time, carrying the weight of someone who had expected a negotiation and received a declaration instead. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way Rachel had never heard directed at her before. I hope you can live with yourself, knowing that your sister is struggling while you count your money in your expensive apartment. Some things are more important than financial planning, Mija, but I guess you'll have to figure that out for yourself. The line went dead, leaving Rachel sitting in her office holding a phone that suddenly felt very heavy. She had just done something she'd never done before in a family conflict. She had said no clearly and definitively, without offering compromises or seeking approval for her decision. The relief she felt was immediate and overwhelming, followed quickly by a wave of anxiety about the consequences she would face for choosing herself over family harmony. But underneath both emotions was something steadier and more important: the knowledge that she had finally acted in accordance with her own values rather than her family's expectations. Rachel spent the rest of the afternoon creating a detailed financial plan that would allow her to help Isabella in practical ways without sacrificing her own security. She researched apartment hunting resources, job placement services, and financial counseling programs that Isabella could access for free or at low cost. She calculated how much she could afford to loan Isabella at low interest, with clear terms and repayment schedules. The plan wasn't as simple as writing monthly checks into a joint account, but it was designed to actually solve Isabella's problems, rather than just managing them. It required Isabella to take active steps toward financial independence, while providing Rachel with protection against unlimited financial exposure. Thursday passed without any contact from her family, which felt both peaceful and ominous. Rachel had grown accustomed to regular text messages, calls, and social media interactions with her parents and siblings, and the sudden silence felt like the calm before a storm she couldn't predict or prepare for. Friday morning brought a series of notifications that confirmed Rachel's suspicions about how her family would respond to her refusal to participate in their financial plan. Isabella had posted a long social media message about learning who your real friends are during difficult times, accompanied by a photo of herself looking sad and vulnerable. The post didn't mention Rachel by name, but the timing and tone made it clear that Isabella was creating a public narrative about being abandoned by family during her time of need. Carmen had shared Isabella's post with her own comment about how heartbreaking it was to watch children struggle while others chose material comfort over family loyalty. Again, no names were mentioned, but the message was clearly directed at Rachel and designed to mobilize family friends and extended relatives to pressure her into reconsidering her decision. Rachel screenshotted both posts and forwarded them to Jennifer, who responded with a simple message: "Classic manipulation tactics. They're trying to shame you into compliance by making your boundary setting look like cruelty. Don't take the bait." The advice was sound, but following it felt impossible when Rachel's phone began buzzing with messages from cousins, family friends, and extended relatives who had seen the social media posts and wanted to understand why Rachel wasn't helping Isabella during her financial crisis. Each message was politely worded and carefully neutral, but they all carried the same underlying question: how could someone with Rachel's income and stability justify refusing to help family? Rachel realized that her family had created a public relations campaign designed to isolate her and force her capitulation through social pressure. They were using her reputation as a responsible, successful family member against her, making her look selfish and cold for refusing to sacrifice her financial security for Isabella's comfort. The strategy might have worked if Rachel hadn't spent the week researching family dynamics and boundary setting. Instead of feeling guilty or defensive, she felt angry that her family was willing to damage her relationships with extended relatives in order to coerce her compliance with their financial plan. Saturday afternoon brought a surprise visitor to Rachel's apartment. Isabella stood in the hallway outside Rachel's door, holding a large coffee and wearing the kind of casual outfit that looked effortless but probably cost more than Rachel spent on clothes in 3 months. Her expression was a carefully composed mixture of hurt and hope, the same look she'd used since childhood when she wanted something from someone who had initially said no. "Can we talk?" Isabella asked, her voice soft and vulnerable. "I feel like there's been a huge misunderstanding about the family fund, and I really want to clear the air between us." Rachel led her sister into the apartment, noting how Isabella's eyes immediately began cataloging the furniture, decorations, and general atmosphere of prosperity that their mother had used to justify Rachel's larger contribution to the fund. Isabella settled onto the couch with the kind of graceful confidence that came from knowing she belonged wherever she chose to sit. I had no idea Mom was going to ask you for $800 a month, Isabella began, her tone suggesting that she had been as surprised as Rachel by the amount. When she told me about the family fund, I thought everyone would contribute the same amount, like $50 or $100 each. I was shocked when I found out how much she expected from you. Rachel sat in the chair across from the couch, maintaining physical distance while she tried to evaluate whether Isabella's surprise was genuine or performed. Did you tell her that $800 was too much? Isabella's pause was brief but noticeable. I tried to, but you know how Mom is when she's made up her mind about something. She had all these calculations about your income and expenses, and she was convinced that you could afford it without any problem. I felt terrible asking for help in the first place, and when she started talking about how much everyone should contribute, I just didn't know how to argue with her math. The explanation felt partially true but incomplete, like Isabella was acknowledging her role in the situation while minimizing her responsibility for how it had developed. Rachel suspected that Isabella had been more involved in planning the family fund than she was now admitting, but she also recognized that Isabella genuinely seemed uncomfortable with the amount of money being requested. What would you prefer? Rachel asked. If you could design a way for the family to help you, what would that look like? Isabella brightened, apparently interpreting Rachel's question as an opening for negotiation, rather than a request for information. Honestly, I just need help getting caught up on my bills and maybe some support while I look for a better job. I don't need a permanent monthly allowance or anything like that. Maybe if everyone could help me out for a few months, just until I get stabilized, that would be enough. Rachel recognized the language of temporary assistance that never seemed to end, the same pattern that had characterized Isabella's financial crises throughout college and her early 20s. Isabella wasn't asking for permanent support, but she also wasn't offering any concrete plans for achieving the financial stability that would make support unnecessary. What have you done so far to address the problems? Rachel asked. Have you looked for additional work, created a budget, or applied for any assistance programs? Isabella's expression shifted slightly, taking on the defensive edge that appeared whenever someone questioned her efforts rather than simply offering help. I've been trying, but it's not as easy as you might think. The job market for gallery workers is really competitive, and most of the positions that pay well require experience I don't have yet. I've been applying for everything, but it takes time. Rachel pulled out her laptop and opened the document she'd created with resources and alternatives to the family fund. I've been researching options that might help you become financially independent more quickly. There are job placement services, financial counseling programs, and even some grant programs for people in creative fields. Isabella accepted the printed pages Rachel handed her, but her expression suggested she was humoring Rachel rather than genuinely considering the suggestions. This is really thoughtful, Rach, but what I need right now isn't more research or counseling. I need money to pay my bills before they shut off my utilities and ruin my credit. The conversation was following a familiar pattern where Isabella acknowledged Rachel's efforts while redirecting attention back to her immediate financial needs. Rachel realized that her sister wasn't interested in solutions that required her to change her lifestyle or take active steps toward independence. She wanted solutions that involved other people providing money while she continued living as she had before. I can help you with emergency expenses, Rachel said, but I'm not comfortable with the family fund as Mom structured it. If you need money for utilities or rent this month, I can loan you a specific amount with clear repayment terms. Isabella's expression brightened again, but this time Rachel could see the calculation behind her sister's enthusiasm. That would be amazing. How much could you loan me? And what would the repayment terms look like? Rachel had prepared for this question and had specific numbers ready. I could loan you up to $1,500 at 1% interest, with repayment starting in 3 months and spread over 18 months. That would give you time to stabilize your income while keeping the payments manageable. The terms were generous by any objective standard, offering Isabella emergency assistance at below-market interest rates with a grace period that would allow her to address her job situation before beginning repayment. But Isabella's response made it clear that she had been hoping for something closer to a gift than a loan. 18 months feels like a really long time to be making payments, Isabella said, and 1% interest seems kind of formal for family. I was hoping for something more flexible. where I could pay you back when I'm in a better position financially. Rachel recognized the request for indefinite repayment terms that had characterized all of Isabella's previous borrowing. Her sister wanted the security of knowing money was available without the accountability of structured repayment, the same arrangement that had resulted in hundreds of dollars in unpaid loans over the years. "The structure protects both of us," Rachel explained. "You know exactly what you owe and when it's due, and I know when to expect repayment. It removes the awkwardness of having to ask for money back or wonder when you might be ready to pay." Isabella set the papers aside and leaned forward, her expression taking on the earnest sincerity she used when she was about to make an emotional appeal. "Rach, I feel like you're turning our relationship into a business transaction. We're sisters, not a bank and a customer. I thought family was supposed to help family without keeping score or charging interest." The accusation hit Rachel in the familiar place where guilt and obligation lived, but this time she was prepared for it. Instead of feeling defensive, she felt clarity about the difference between helping and enabling, between supporting family and subsidizing irresponsibility. Family is supposed to help family, Rachel agreed, but help should actually solve problems, not just manage them indefinitely. "The family fund would make me responsible for your financial stability without giving you any incentive to become financially stable yourself." Isabella's composure cracked slightly, revealing the frustration underneath her carefully maintained vulnerability. "So you're saying I'm financially irresponsible? You're saying I don't deserve help because I haven't managed money as well as you have?" Rachel felt the conversation spiraling toward emotional territory that would make rational discussion impossible. But she also recognized that Isabella's reaction revealed important truths about how her sister viewed the situation. Isabella wasn't asking for help becoming financially responsible. She was asking for help avoiding the consequences of financial irresponsibility. "I'm saying I want to help you in ways that actually help," Rachel replied. "Giving you money every month without requiring you to change anything about how you manage money won't solve your problems. It will just transfer your problems to me." Isabella stood up from the couch with the fluid grace of someone preparing to make a dramatic exit. "I guess I was wrong about you, Rachel. I thought you were the kind of person who cared more about family than money, but apparently I was mistaken." The words were designed to sting, to make Rachel question her motives and reconsider her position. But instead of feeling hurt, Rachel felt sad that her sister's primary strategy for dealing with conflict was emotional manipulation rather than honest communication. "I do care about family," Rachel said. "That's why I want to help you become independent instead of dependent. That's why I'm offering you a loan with reasonable terms instead of just writing checks into an account I can't control." Isabella gathered her purse and jacket with sharp, efficient movements that communicated her displeasure more clearly than words. "Your loan comes with so many strings attached that it might as well be a business contract. The family fund was about love and support. I guess I know which one you prefer." After Isabella left, Rachel sat in her living room feeling drained but also strangely relieved. The conversation had confirmed her suspicions about her family's motivations and her sister's expectations. Isabella didn't want help becoming financially stable. She wanted help maintaining financial instability without facing consequences. The family fund wasn't designed to solve problems. It was designed to make Rachel responsible for problems she hadn't created and couldn't control. Sunday morning brought a text message from Carmen. "Family dinner is canceled today. I think everyone needs time to think about what's really important." The message was clearly meant to punish Rachel for her refusal to participate in the family fund, but it felt more like a gift. Instead of spending the afternoon navigating tension and passive-aggressive comments about her selfishness, Rachel had an unexpected day of freedom to spend however she chose. She drove to the coast and spent the day walking on the beach, thinking about the patterns that had shaped her family relationships and the changes she wanted to make going forward. The ocean air and physical movement helped clear her mind of the guilt and anxiety that had accumulated over the past week, replacing them with a sense of purpose and determination. By evening, Rachel had made several important decisions about how she wanted to proceed. She would not participate in the family fund under any circumstances, but she would continue offering practical help to Isabella through structured loans and resource sharing. She would not engage in arguments or justifications about her decision, but she would clearly communicate her boundaries when they were tested. Most importantly, she would not allow her family's disapproval to change her commitment to her own financial security and independence. Monday morning found Rachel back at work with a renewed sense of focus and energy. The decision to prioritize her own financial well-being over her family's expectations had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in years, her money felt truly her own, not subject to redistribution based on other people's assessment of her obligations or abilities. The week passed peacefully, with no contact from her family and no pressure to reconsider her decision. Rachel began to hope that the crisis had passed, that her family had accepted her refusal and moved on to other solutions for Isabella's financial problems. That hope was shattered Friday afternoon when she checked her bank account and discovered that $1,200 had been withdrawn from her checking account, along with an overdraft fee for an additional $35. The transaction was labeled as an automatic transfer to the Martinez family fund, initiated through the shared access Carmen had established years earlier for family emergencies. Rachel stared at her phone screen in disbelief, trying to understand how money had been taken from her account for a fund she'd never agreed to join. The answer came in a sinking realization that made her stomach clench with anger and betrayal. Her mother had used the emergency access Rachel had granted her years earlier to authorize the family fund transfer without Rachel's consent. The violation felt like discovering that someone had been reading her diary or searching through her personal belongings. Carmen had taken money from Rachel's account not because she had permission, but because she had access, and because she believed Rachel's refusal to participate was a temporary obstacle to be overcome, rather than a permanent decision to be respected. Rachel called the bank immediately, demanding an explanation for how someone could withdraw money from her account without her authorization. The customer service representative explained that Carmen Martinez was listed as an authorized user with full access to Rachel's checking account, a status that had been established years earlier when Rachel was in college and needed someone to help manage her finances during a medical emergency. The authorization had never been revoked because Rachel had forgotten it existed, and because she had trusted that her mother would only use it for actual emergencies. Now she realized that Carmen had redefined emergency to include any situation where Rachel was reluctant to provide money her family believed she should contribute. Rachel immediately revoked her mother's access to all her accounts and initiated a dispute for the unauthorized transfer, but the bank representative warned her that recovering the money might be difficult since the authorization had been technically legitimate, even if the specific transaction hadn't been approved. The theft, because that's what it was regardless of the technical authorization, represented more than just lost money. It represented a complete breakdown of trust and respect between Rachel and her family. Carmen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, taking something that didn't belong to her because she believed her judgment about how Rachel should spend her money was more important than Rachel's own choices. Rachel sat in her car outside the bank, looking at the documentation she'd received about the disputed transaction, and realized that her relationship with her family had fundamentally changed. They had shown her that they viewed her money as a family resource subject to their collective decision-making, and that they were willing to take it by force when persuasion failed. The knowledge felt liberating in an unexpected way. Rachel no longer had to wonder whether her family respected her boundaries or valued her autonomy. They had answered those questions clearly through their actions, and now she could respond accordingly without guilt or uncertainty about whether she was being unreasonable. Rachel drove home and spent the evening researching legal options for recovering her money and protecting herself from future unauthorized access. She also began planning the conversation she would have with her family, not to seek reconciliation or understanding, but to clearly communicate the new terms under which their relationship would continue. The family fund had been designed to make Rachel responsible for Isabella's financial problems, but it had actually accomplished something entirely different. It had forced Rachel to recognize that her family's love came with conditions that she was no longer willing to accept. Rachel spent Saturday morning documenting everything. She printed bank statements, saved screenshots of Isabella's social media posts, and created a timeline of events that began with the family meeting and ended with the unauthorized withdrawal of $1,200 from her checking account. The process felt clinical and necessary, like preparing evidence for a trial where the defendants were people she had once trusted without question. The documentation revealed patterns she hadn't noticed while living through them. Carmen's text messages showed a progression from requests to demands to ultimatums. with each escalation designed to increase pressure and reduce Rachel's options for resistance. Isabella's social media activity demonstrated a lifestyle inconsistent with financial crisis, including purchases and activities that would have been impossible if she were truly struggling to afford basic necessities. Most damning was the timeline itself, which showed that the unauthorized withdrawal had occurred exactly 1 week after Rachel's explicit refusal to participate in the family fund. The theft had been planned and deliberate, not an impulsive mistake or misunderstanding. Carmen had chosen to violate Rachel's financial autonomy rather than accept her decision, treating Rachel's bank account like community property that could be accessed whenever the family's collective judgment overruled Rachel's individual choices. The violation was so complete and calculated that Rachel felt like she was seeing her family clearly for the first time in her adult life. Sunday morning brought a knock on Rachel's apartment door that she had been expecting since Friday evening. Through the peephole, she could see her parents standing in the hallway, both dressed in their church clothes and wearing expressions of determined resolution. Carmen held a small gift bag, the kind she brought when she was planning to smooth over conflict with gestures of affection and reminders of family bonds. Rachel opened the door but didn't invite them inside, standing in the doorway like a barrier between her personal space and their presence. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a physical representation of the boundaries she was learning to establish and maintain. "Misha, we need to talk," Carmen said, her voice carrying the forced warmth she used when she was trying to control a conversation's emotional temperature. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding about the bank account, and we want to clear everything up." Miguel stood slightly behind his wife, his expression uncomfortable but resigned, like someone who had been drafted into a conflict he would have preferred to avoid. He nodded at Rachel but didn't speak, apparently having been assigned the role of silent support rather than active participant in whatever strategy Carmen had developed for this conversation. "There's no misunderstanding," Rachel replied, her voice calm and factual. "You took money from my account without my permission after I explicitly refused to participate in the family fund. That's theft, regardless of whether you had technical access to do it." Carmen's carefully composed expression flickered with surprise and something that might have been respect. She had clearly expected guilt, defensiveness, or emotional vulnerability, not the cold clarity of someone who had already processed the betrayal and reached conclusions about its meaning. "Rachel, honey, I only used the emergency access because I was worried you were making a mistake you'd regret later," Carmen said, shifting tactics from denial to maternal concern. "Isabella was about to have her utilities shut off, and I knew that if that happened, you'd feel terrible for not helping when you could afford to. I was protecting you from your own guilt." The explanation revealed so much about how Carmen viewed Rachel's autonomy that it felt like a confession rather than a justification. Carmen genuinely believed that her judgment about Rachel's obligations was more reliable than Rachel's own assessment of her circumstances and priorities. She had taken the money not because she thought she had a right to it, but because she thought Rachel was too confused or selfish to make appropriate decisions about her own resources. "You don't get to protect me from my own choices," Rachel said. "And you don't get to decide what I should feel guilty about. If Isabella's utilities get shut off because I chose not to fund her lifestyle, that's a consequence of her decisions, not mine." Miguel shifted uncomfortably, apparently recognizing that his wife's strategy was backfiring in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Rachel, your mother was just trying to help everyone involved. Maybe the approach wasn't perfect, but the intention was good." Rachel looked at her father with something approaching pity. Miguel had spent decades mediating conflicts by minimizing their significance and attributing malicious actions to good intentions, a strategy that had allowed him to avoid taking sides while enabling increasingly destructive family dynamics. "The approach wasn't imperfect, Dad. It was criminal. Mom stole money from my bank account after I said no to her plan. The intention doesn't matter when the action violates my basic rights." Carmen's composure began to crack, revealing the anger and frustration underneath her maternal concern. "Criminal? Rachel, how can you use that word about your own mother? I've sacrificed everything for this family, and now you're treating me like a stranger who broke into your house." The accusation of ingratitude was Carmen's nuclear option, the emotional weapon she deployed when other tactics failed to produce compliance. Rachel had seen her use it effectively against Miguel and Isabella countless times, transforming their reasonable complaints into evidence of their selfishness and inability to appreciate her sacrifices. But this time, Rachel felt no guilt or obligation to soothe her mother's wounded feelings. Carmen's sacrifices, whatever they had been, didn't create unlimited rights to control other people's lives or resources. Motherhood wasn't a blank check that could be cashed indefinitely without regard for boundaries or consent. "You can be my mother and still be wrong," Rachel said. "You can love me and still violate my trust. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, and pointing out what you did wrong isn't the same as denying what you've done right." Carmen stepped closer to the doorway, apparently hoping that physical proximity would restore the emotional connection she was losing through logic and boundaries. "Misha, this conversation is breaking my heart. We raised you to care about family, to put love ahead of money, and now you're talking like we're enemies instead of the people who've supported you your entire life." Rachel recognized the manipulation embedded in her mother's heartbreak, the way Carmen was making her own emotional distress into evidence of Rachel's moral failure. It was a tactic that had worked for decades, transforming any resistance to Carmen's demands into proof that the resistant person lacked proper family values and compassion. "You supported me when it was convenient, and when I didn't challenge your control," Rachel replied. "But the moment I set boundaries that you didn't like, you violated them. That tells me that your support was conditional on my compliance, not on love." The words hit Carmen like a physical blow, causing her to step backward and clutch the gift bag more tightly. Miguel moved closer to his wife, apparently recognizing that their strategy was not only failing but actively damaging their relationship with their daughter. "Maybe we should all take some time to cool down," Miguel suggested, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone watching a situation spiral beyond his ability to manage. "Everyone's emotions are running high, and we're all saying things we might regret later." Rachel shook her head, feeling clearer and more confident than she had in years. "I'm not emotional, Dad. I'm done. Done with family meetings where decisions about my life are made without my input. Done with being treated like a family ATM. Done with having my boundaries violated and then being blamed for setting them in the first place." Carmen's face went pale, apparently realizing that Rachel's resistance wasn't temporary rebelliousness that could be waited out or manipulated away. "What are you saying, Mija? That you don't want to be part of this family anymore?" The question was designed to force Rachel into an all-or-nothing choice between total capitulation and complete estrangement. But Rachel had learned enough about healthy relationships to recognize false dichotomies and refuse to accept them. "I'm saying I want to be part of a family that respects my autonomy and treats me like an adult," Rachel replied. "If that's not possible, then we'll have whatever relationship is possible within those constraints." Miguel looked genuinely confused, as if Rachel had started speaking a foreign language he couldn't understand. "But honey, family means helping each other. It means putting the group ahead of individual preferences. What you're describing sounds more like a business relationship than a family relationship." Rachel felt sad for her father's inability to imagine family relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation. But she also felt determined not to accept his limitations as her own. Family can mean helping each other while respecting boundaries. It can mean supporting each other without violating autonomy. What you're describing is codependency disguised as love. Carmen's emotional strategy shifted again, this time toward bargaining and compromise. "Okay, maybe $800 was too much to ask. What if we reduced your contribution to something more manageable? $400? $300? We're not unreasonable people, Mija. We can negotiate." The offer revealed that Carmen still didn't understand the fundamental issue. Rachel's refusal wasn't about the amount of money, but about the principle of consent and the right to make her own financial decisions. Reducing the contribution wouldn't address the underlying problem of her family treating her resources as community property subject to their collective management. "This isn't about negotiating a payment plan," Rachel said. "This is about you understanding that my money belongs to me, and I get to decide how it's used. Isabella's financial problems are not my responsibility to solve." Isabella's voice came from behind Rachel's parents, apparently having approached during the conversation without being noticed. "So that's it? Your own sister can lose her apartment, and you don't care as long as your precious savings account stays intact?" Rachel turned to see Isabella standing in the hallway, wearing designer jeans and carrying a coffee that probably cost more than many people spent on breakfast. Her sister's appearance and accusation felt like a perfect encapsulation of the family's dysfunction. Isabella could afford luxury purchases while claiming poverty, and Rachel was expected to subsidize this contradiction without question or complaint. "I care about you," Rachel replied, looking directly at Isabella, "but I don't care about enabling your financial irresponsibility. Those are two different things, even though you treat them as the same." Isabella's composure cracked, revealing the entitled anger that had been building throughout the family's campaign to extract money from Rachel. "Financial irresponsibility? I'm working as hard as I can in a difficult industry, trying to build a career that matters to me. Not everyone can be a soulless corporate analyst who values spreadsheets more than relationships." The personal attack was designed to wound Rachel in the place where her self-confidence was most vulnerable, suggesting that her professional success came at the cost of her humanity and capacity for love. It was a tactic Isabella had learned from their mother, using emotional manipulation to deflect attention from her own behavior and choices. "You're working part-time at a gallery while spending full-time money," Rachel replied, refusing to take the bait or defend her career choices. "That's not a sustainable business model, regardless of how meaningful your work feels to you." Carmen stepped between her daughters, apparently recognizing that the conversation was moving toward territory that would make reconciliation more difficult. "Girls, this isn't helping anyone. We're family, and family finds ways to work together instead of tearing each other down." Rachel felt tired of being told how family should operate by people who had violated every principle of healthy family functioning. Family works together when everyone's voice is heard and respected. What you've been doing is making decisions for me and then demanding that I comply because we share DNA. Miguel made one final attempt to restore the family dynamics that had served him well for decades. "Rachel, what would it take for you to feel comfortable helping your sister? What would need to change for us to find a solution that works for everyone?" The question seemed genuine, as if Miguel was finally willing to consider that Rachel's resistance might be based on legitimate concerns rather than selfish stubbornness. Rachel appreciated the opening, even though she suspected it wouldn't lead to the kind of fundamental changes that would be necessary for her to trust her family's financial management. Isabella would need to create a realistic budget, find full-time employment or additional income sources, and accept responsibility for her own financial stability, Rachel said. "The family would need to treat my resources as mine to control, not community property to be allocated according to collective judgment. And everyone would need to accept that my helping or not helping is my choice to make, not a family decision to impose." The conditions were reasonable by any objective standard, requiring Isabella to take basic steps toward financial independence, while requiring the family to respect Rachel's autonomy. But they also represented a complete restructuring of family dynamics that had been established over decades, and Rachel could see from her family's expressions that such changes felt impossible rather than merely difficult. Carmen shook her head slowly, her expression carrying the weight of someone watching a cherished dream die. "What you're describing isn't family, Misha. It's a group of individuals who happen to be related but don't really care about each other's well-being." Rachel recognized her mother's inability to distinguish between caring about someone and controlling their choices, between supporting family and managing their decisions. Carmen genuinely believed that love required unlimited access to other people's resources and autonomy, and that boundaries were evidence of insufficient affection rather than healthy self-preservation. "What you're describing isn't love," Rachel replied. "It's control disguised as care. Real love respects boundaries. Real family support empowers independence rather than creating dependency." Isabella made a sound of frustrated disgust, apparently realizing that Rachel wasn't going to be persuaded, guilted, or manipulated into changing her position. "Fine. I'll figure it out myself, since apparently that's what family means to you. But don't expect me to forget how you abandoned me when I needed help the most." The threat of permanent resentment was Isabella's final card, the nuclear option designed to force Rachel's capitulation through fear of losing her sister's love. But Rachel had already learned that relationships based on financial transactions weren't relationships worth preserving, and that Isabella's love, if it could only be maintained through monetary contributions, wasn't the kind of love that enriched her life. "I hope you do figure it out," Rachel said, meaning it sincerely. "And I hope you do it in a way that makes you stronger and more independent, not more dependent on other people's resources." Carmen handed Rachel the gift bag she had been holding, a final gesture of maternal affection designed to soften the conflict's sharp edges. "This is the sweater you admired when we went shopping last month. I thought you might like to have it." Rachel accepted the bag, but didn't open it, recognizing the gift as both a genuine expression of love and a calculated attempt to create emotional debt that could be leveraged in future conflicts. The complexity of her mother's motivations no longer confused or manipulated her the way it once had. "Thank you," Rachel said simply, without the effusive gratitude Carmen was clearly hoping to receive. The family stood in the hallway for several more minutes, apparently hoping that someone would find words to bridge the gap that had opened between Rachel and the rest of them. But Rachel felt no obligation to smooth over conflict she hadn't created or apologize for boundaries she had every right to establish. Miguel finally broke the silence with the kind of practical suggestion he used when emotional solutions proved elusive. "Maybe we should all think about this for a week or two and then see if we can find some middle ground." Rachel nodded, knowing that time wouldn't change the fundamental issues but willing to allow her family space to process what had happened. "I'll be here when you're ready to respect my boundaries. Until then, I think it's better if we don't have contact." Carmen's eyes filled with tears, apparently realizing that Rachel's statement wasn't a negotiating tactic, but a genuine boundary with real consequences. "Mija, you're breaking my heart. How can you choose money over family?" The accusation felt familiar and powerless now, like hearing a song that had once moved her but no longer carried emotional weight. Rachel had learned to distinguish between choosing money over family and choosing self-respect over manipulation, between selfishness and healthy boundaries. "I'm choosing self-respect over control," Rachel replied. "I'm choosing boundaries over violation. If that breaks your heart, maybe you should examine why my autonomy threatens you so much." After her family left, Rachel sat in her living room feeling emotionally drained but also strangely liberated. The confrontation had been difficult and painful, but it had also clarified the terms under which future relationships would be possible. Her family now understood that she would not be manipulated, violated, or controlled, regardless of the emotional or relational consequences of maintaining those boundaries. Monday morning brought a call from the bank's fraud department, informing Rachel that her dispute had been escalated to the legal department for review. The representative explained that while Carmen had possessed technical authorization to access the account, using that access to withdraw money for purposes Rachel had explicitly opposed might constitute financial abuse under state law. The legal terminology felt stark and serious in a way that family dysfunction rarely did. But Rachel realized that what her mother had done met the technical definition of financial abuse regardless of her intentions or family status. Carmen had used her access to Rachel's account to control her behavior and override her decisions, which was exactly what financial abuse laws were designed to prevent. Tuesday brought a text message from Diego, the first communication Rachel had received from any family member since Sunday's confrontation. "Mom is really upset and Dad doesn't know what to do. Is there any way you could call them? They think you hate them now." The message revealed how her family was processing the conflict, interpreting Rachel's boundaries as evidence of hatred rather than self-protection. Diego apparently believed that reconciliation required Rachel to resume contact without any acknowledgement of the violations that had prompted her withdrawal. Rachel responded with a simple message. "I don't hate anyone. I'm protecting myself from being violated again. They know what needs to change for us to have a relationship." Diego's response came quickly. "But you're asking them to change everything about how our family works. That's not fair to expect." The exchange illuminated the core problem that made reconciliation unlikely. Rachel's family viewed their dysfunctional patterns as essential features of family identity, rather than problems to be solved. Asking them to respect boundaries felt, to them, like asking them to stop being a family altogether. Rachel didn't respond to Diego's second message, recognizing that he wasn't ready to understand the difference between healthy family dynamics and the controlling patterns they had all grown up accepting as normal. She hoped that eventually her family would recognize the distinction, but she wasn't willing to sacrifice her well-being while waiting for that recognition to develop. Wednesday brought news that the bank had recovered the $1,200 from the family fund account and returned it to Rachel's checking account, along with the overdraft fee that had been charged. The recovery had been possible because Carmen had been unable to provide documentation showing Rachel's consent to the transfer, and because the family fund account had contained sufficient funds to reverse the transaction. The financial restoration felt like vindication, proof that Rachel's assessment of the situation had been accurate, and that her family's actions had been wrong by objective legal standards. But the emotional restoration would take longer, requiring time and evidence that her family could learn to respect boundaries rather than simply being forced to acknowledge them. Rachel used the recovered money to establish a new savings account at a different bank, one where no family members had access or even knowledge of its existence. The account represented more than just financial security. It represented a space in her life that was completely her own, free from family input, judgment, or management. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Rachel's office. Isabella stood in the reception area, wearing a professional outfit Rachel had never seen before, her usual casual elegance replaced by something more serious and purposeful. "I got a job," Isabella said without preamble, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "Full-time, at an art consulting firm downtown. The pay is better than the gallery, and they said there's room for advancement if I prove myself." Rachel felt genuinely happy for her sister, recognizing the effort it must have taken for Isabella to find and secure full-time employment after years of part-time work and financial instability. "Congratulations! That's wonderful news." Isabella sat down in the chair across from Rachel's desk, apparently having prepared for a longer conversation than a simple announcement. "I wanted you to know because I realize now that you were right about some things. I was expecting other people to solve my problems instead of solving them myself." The admission felt significant, representing more self-awareness than Isabella had ever demonstrated about her financial patterns and their impact on family relationships. Rachel appreciated the acknowledgement while remaining cautious about its implications for future interactions. "What changed your mind?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious about Isabella's process of recognition and growth. Isabella looked uncomfortable, apparently struggling to articulate insights that challenged her previous worldview. "When Mom took money from your account, I realized that I had become someone who let other people steal from my sister to pay my bills. That's not who I want to be." The recognition felt profound, suggesting that Isabella had begun to understand the ethical implications of the family fund rather than just its financial logistics. Rachel felt cautiously optimistic that her sister might be developing the capacity for genuine independence rather than just temporary self-sufficiency. "I'm proud of you for recognizing that and making changes," Rachel said. "It takes courage to change patterns that have worked in the past, even when you recognize they weren't healthy." Isabella nodded, apparently appreciating Rachel's validation, while also struggling with the implications of her new self-awareness. "I want to pay you back for all the money I borrowed over the years. I don't have exact records, but I think it was probably around $2,000. The offer surprised Rachel both in its existence and its accuracy. Isabella had apparently been more aware of her debts than she had ever acknowledged, suggesting that her previous inability to repay had been more about priorities than memory or mathematics. "That's not necessary," Rachel replied. "Those were gifts, not loans, regardless of what we called them at the time." Isabella shook her head firmly, apparently having prepared for this response. "They were loans that I never paid back because nobody held me accountable. I want to pay them back now, because I want to have a relationship with you that's based on respect, not just family obligation." The distinction revealed sophisticated thinking about relationship dynamics that Isabella had never demonstrated before. Rachel realized that her sister was attempting to rebuild their relationship on healthier foundations, even though it would be easier and more comfortable to simply move forward without addressing past financial imbalances. "If that's what you want, I'm willing to accept repayment," Rachel said. "But I want you to do it in a way that doesn't compromise your own financial stability. Maybe $50 a month until it's paid off?" Isabella smiled, apparently relieved that Rachel was willing to accept her gesture of accountability without making it punitive or difficult. "That works. And Rachel? I'm sorry for everything that happened with the family fund. I should have stopped it when I realized how much they were asking from you." The apology felt genuine and complete, acknowledging both Isabella's role in creating the situation and her responsibility for allowing it to continue. Rachel appreciated the recognition while also understanding that rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time, not just a single conversation. "I appreciate that," Rachel said, "and I'm glad you found a job that gives you the independence you've been looking for." After Isabella left, Rachel sat in her office thinking about the possibility of reconciliation based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Her sister's transformation suggested that people could learn to recognize unhealthy patterns and make genuine changes, even when those patterns had been reinforced by family dynamics for decades. Friday afternoon brought a call from her father, the first time Miguel had initiated contact since the confrontation on Sunday. His voice sounded tired and uncertain, lacking the confidence he usually projected during family conflicts. "Rachel, I've been thinking about what you said about boundaries and respect," he began, apparently having spent the week processing concepts that were foreign to his understanding of family relationships. "I'm not sure I understand everything you meant, but I want to try." The admission represented more vulnerability than Miguel had ever shown Rachel, suggesting that the family crisis had forced him to examine assumptions he had never questioned before. Rachel felt cautiously hopeful that her father might be capable of growth and change, even though such transformation would require fundamental shifts in his worldview. "What specifically would you like to understand?" Rachel asked, offering to engage in education rather than confrontation. Miguel was quiet for several moments, apparently struggling to articulate questions about concepts he was just beginning to recognize. "When you said that taking money from your account was wrong even though your mother had access, I didn't understand at first. But I've been thinking about it, and I realize that having permission to do something isn't the same as having a right to do it." The distinction showed sophisticated moral reasoning that surprised Rachel with its clarity and accuracy. Miguel was apparently capable of understanding complex ethical principles when he applied focused attention to them, rather than relying on the simplified family loyalty frameworks he had used throughout his adult life. "That's exactly right," Rachel confirmed. "Mom had access to my account for emergencies, but using it to override my explicit refusal to participate in the family fund was a violation of trust, not an appropriate use of emergency access." Miguel sighed heavily, apparently recognizing the implications of this principle for many decisions he had supported or ignored over the years. "Your mother and I have been making decisions for this family for so long that we forgot other people had the right to disagree with us." The recognition felt profound, representing a fundamental shift in Miguel's understanding of authority and autonomy within family relationships. Rachel realized that her father was beginning to distinguish between leadership and control, between making decisions for his family and making decisions with their input and consent. "It's never too late to change those patterns," Rachel said, "but it requires recognizing that other people's autonomy is more important than family harmony, and that real harmony comes from respecting differences rather than eliminating them." Miguel was quiet again, apparently processing ideas that challenged everything he had believed about successful family management. "Would you be willing to have dinner with your mother and me next week? Not to negotiate or argue, but just to talk about how we can do things differently." The invitation represented exactly the kind of conversation Rachel had been hoping for, an opportunity to rebuild family relationships on healthier foundations, rather than simply enforcing boundaries against unhealthy patterns. She appreciated Miguel's apparent recognition that change would require effort and conversation, not just good intentions. "I'd be willing to do that," Rachel replied. "But I want to be clear that rebuilding our relationship will take time and consistent respect for boundaries. One dinner won't fix everything that's been broken." Miguel's response carried the humility of someone who had finally recognized the scope of problems he had previously minimized or ignored. "I understand. And Rachel? I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even when it was hard, and even when we made it harder than it needed to be. The conversation ended with plans for dinner the following Saturday, giving both sides time to prepare for a discussion that would determine whether reconciliation was possible or whether Rachel's boundaries would need to remain permanently in place. Saturday evening found Rachel sitting across from her parents in a quiet restaurant near downtown Portland, neutral territory that belonged to none of them and carried no history of family conflicts or power struggles. Carmen looked older than Rachel remembered, apparently aged by a week of recognizing that her parenting strategies had driven away the daughter she had been trying to control. "I've been thinking about what you said about autonomy and respect," Carmen began, her voice lacking its usual authority and certainty. "I realize that I've been treating your success as family property rather than your personal achievement." The admission represented a fundamental shift in how Carmen understood individual accomplishment within family contexts. Rachel appreciated the recognition while remaining cautious about whether her mother could consistently apply this new understanding to future interactions. "I worked hard to build financial stability," Rachel replied. "And I want to share the benefits of that stability with family, but only in ways that respect my right to make my own decisions about how and when to help." Carmen nodded slowly, apparently struggling to integrate these concepts with her previous understanding of family obligation and mutual support. "I think I confused helping family with managing family. I thought if I could just arrange everything correctly, everyone would be happy and secure." The distinction revealed significant self-awareness about the difference between supporting people and controlling their choices. Rachel realized that her mother was beginning to understand how her well-intentioned management had become harmful interference that damaged the relationships she was trying to protect. Miguel leaned forward, apparently prepared to address his own role in the family's dysfunction. "I've been thinking about how I always tried to keep peace instead of addressing problems. I realize now that avoiding conflict didn't eliminate it. It just pushed it underground, where it could grow bigger and more destructive." The recognition showed sophisticated understanding of conflict resolution and family dynamics. Rachel felt encouraged that both parents were demonstrating the capacity for genuine insight and change, rather than just superficial modifications designed to restore their preferred family dynamics. "Keeping peace and enabling bad behavior aren't the same thing," Rachel agreed. "Real peace comes from everyone feeling heard and respected, not from some people giving up their needs to avoid upsetting others." Carmen reached across the table and touched Rachel's hand, a gesture that felt tentative and uncertain rather than automatically entitled to physical affection. "Mija, can you forgive us for not understanding these things sooner? Can we start over with what we know now instead of what we thought we knew before?" The request felt genuine and humble, representing a willingness to acknowledge fault and accept responsibility rather than simply hoping to move forward without addressing what had gone wrong. Rachel appreciated the gesture while also understanding that forgiveness would need to be earned through consistent behavior over time. "I can forgive the past," Rachel replied, "but rebuilding trust will require you to respect my boundaries consistently, not just when it's convenient or when you agree with them." Carmen squeezed Rachel's hand gently, apparently understanding that reconciliation would require ongoing effort rather than a single conversation or gesture. "I want to learn how to be your mother in ways that support your independence rather than threatening it." The evening continued with practical discussions about how family relationships could function with mutual respect and clear boundaries. Rachel explained her willingness to help family members in ways that empowered their independence, rather than creating dependency. Her parents shared their recognition that managing adult children's choices had become a destructive habit, rather than helpful parenting. By the end of dinner, they had established new guidelines for family interactions that respected everyone's autonomy while maintaining emotional connections. Family meetings would include input from all affected parties before decisions were made. Financial requests would be handled through transparent discussions, rather than guilt or pressure tactics. Personal boundaries would be treated as information about how to love people well, rather than obstacles to overcome. The changes wouldn't be easy or automatic, requiring conscious effort and consistent practice to replace decades of established patterns. But for the first time in years, Rachel felt hopeful that her family relationships could become sources of support and connection rather than stress and conflict. 3 months later, Rachel's life had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and fundamentally different. She continued working at the renewable energy firm, saving money, and enjoying her independence. But now those activities occurred within the context of family relationships, based on mutual respect rather than financial extraction. Isabella had proven successful at her new job, earning praise from her supervisors and demonstrating the professional competence that had been hidden beneath years of financial instability. She made her $50 monthly payments to Rachel reliably and had begun building her own emergency fund, apparently having learned the security that comes from financial independence. Carmen had enrolled in a family therapy workshop focused on supporting adult children's independence, apparently recognizing that good intentions weren't sufficient to create healthy relationships. She called Rachel weekly but respected her daughter's right to decline invitations or delay responses when work or personal commitments took priority. Miguel had begun expressing his own opinions during family discussions rather than defaulting to Carmen's preferences, apparently having discovered that peace through authentic communication was more satisfying than peace through conflict avoidance. He and Rachel had developed a relationship based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than obligation and duty. The family still gathered monthly for dinners, but the meetings felt like genuine social connections rather than administrative sessions where decisions about other people's lives were made without their input. Everyone contributed to conversations, everyone's perspectives were heard, and disagreements were treated as information to consider rather than problems to eliminate. Rachel's bank account remained entirely under her control, and her financial decisions were made based on her own priorities and values rather than family pressure or guilt. She had begun contributing to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, finding satisfaction in supporting people who were working to build independence rather than enabling those who preferred dependency. The transformation hadn't been perfect or complete. Old patterns occasionally resurfaced during stressful family situations, requiring conscious effort to maintain new boundaries and communication styles. But the fundamental shift from control to respect had created space for genuine growth and connection that enriched everyone's lives. Rachel realized that setting boundaries hadn't destroyed her family relationships. It had saved them. By refusing to accept financial exploitation disguised as family loyalty, she had forced everyone to develop healthier ways of expressing love and support. The crisis that had once threatened to tear them apart had ultimately taught them how to be family in ways that honored both individual autonomy and collective connection. Standing in her apartment on a quiet Sunday evening, looking out at the Portland skyline and thinking about the week ahead, Rachel felt a deep sense of gratitude for the courage she had found to say no when saying yes would have been easier, but ultimately destructive. The family fund had been designed to make her responsible for other people's choices, but it had actually taught her that she was only responsible for her own choices, and that making good choices sometimes required disappointing people who preferred her to make bad ones. The lesson had been expensive in terms of temporary family harmony, but it had been invaluable in terms of long-term well-being and authentic relationships. Rachel had learned that love without respect was manipulation, that family without boundaries was dysfunction, and that saying no to the wrong things was the only way to say yes to the right ones. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Isabella. "Got promoted to senior consultant today. Taking myself out for a celebration dinner that I can actually afford. Thanks for teaching me that independence feels better than dependency, even when it's harder." Rachel smiled, recognizing in her sister's message the kind of growth that was only possible when people were allowed to succeed or fail based on their own efforts, rather than being rescued from the consequences of their choices. The family fund had promised to solve Isabella's problems, but helping Isabella learn to solve her own problems had been far more valuable for everyone involved. The story of the Martinez family fund had ended not with the restoration of old patterns, but with the creation of new ones based on mutual respect, individual responsibility, and authentic love. Rachel had discovered that the best way to help family was sometimes to refuse to help them in ways that prevented their growth, and that the strongest families were those where everyone was free to succeed or fail based on their own choices, rather than being managed by someone else's good intentions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.